But be that as it may, let's go ahead and get started, Leanne, and then they can show up and, we'll be on time anyway.
You got it. Well, good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you may be tuning in from. I hope you've had a great day, great Tuesday, getting ready for Turkey Day. First, before we get started, I have to put out my little caveat disclaimer that you are being recorded. You see that red button up there in the upper left-hand corner. And yeah, if it's not okay, except for you, Tom, but if it's not okay, then you guys will just have to leave because we do upload these for viewing later. And lots of people have been watching them in the member portal and those that are registered to watch them. So it's Tuesday, and that means we have someone here to talk Tiny, and we're going to hear his story, but I'm going to let Robin introduce him because he is familiar with him, and I'm going to be right here. If you guys have any questions for Tom, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can put it in the chat and I'm happy to read the question for you. So with that, we're going to get started. Robin?
All right, welcome everybody. I have my headset on because I have a new computer and I haven't figured out how to get the mic working. So we are working with whatever we have here. Well, I'm very happy to have you guys on today, a few days before Thanksgiving. And this is it for this week. Probably Leanne will make another announcement at the end to remind you that we don't have anything tomorrow or the next day. Next Monday will be the first day that we come on with these workshops. And so, we are kind of, these Tiny Talks are kind of interesting in that we're moving in the direction of more like a TED Talk than a Tiny Talk. And that's one of the interesting things that we're trying to accomplish here going forward, where we can do more like a TED Talk. But let me tell you, I have known Tom for a long time. I don't even know how long I've known Tom, but I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about himself. But I've met him at a lot of shows. He used to go to a lot of shows. He's kind of backed down a little bit more. I know he has lived in some interesting vehicles and lived tiny. And I think he's the only one that I know of anyway that lived in an ambulance. And so let me turn things over to him for right now. Tom, if it's okay, can we kind of chat back and forth, ask some questions? And then can I interrupt you if you're on a roll, if there's a question, or would you rather hold that until the end?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah.
Either way,
okay.
You want to hold it to the end or you want to interrupt in the middle?
Oh, no, that's fine. I would say it'd probably be more helpful if we can do things in a more interactive fashion. So I don't think that I don't have so much prepared that needs me to, continue on about anything that I've got prepared in such a way that I'll need 45 minutes and then quick 15 Q&A. So I'd rather have it be something where we can make this a little bit more in-depth and immersive for people. So.
Perfect. And we're trying to cut back on the hour-long. So we're trying to keep them a little bit shorter. Yesterday's was about 45 minutes. And, I know you guys are on every night and it's taken a lot of time. So we're trying to get through the meat, through a lot of good content. And then once we're done with that, we're done. We don't try to fluff things up or anything like that. So Tom, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Oh, sure. So let's see, about 10 years ago, I decided that if there was something I could do to help the world, what would that be? I'm a career marketing guy. That's what I did, was film, video, brand development. My wife and I met 32 years ago, married 32 years ago after art school. So I've kind of a creative mindset to begin with, and that's always been different sorts of things. But you do enough websites, you do enough brand development and other things. It's like, well, if I'm going to promote something, I'd like to promote something I really believe in. And that's where I started looking at green building. And among green building things, because I'm a 13th generation builder, what of green building would I be interested in? And the more I started to look at things like structural insulated panels and panelized construction for small homes, I realized that the big thing you could do if you wanted to make your carbon footprint smaller was to start small if you could, and within that small footprint, keep it as small and sustainable as well. So what we ended up doing was starting our own company, which is our company Timber Trails LLC it's our LLC. We have the go-to-market brand Go Tiny, and that's what we basically do. So right now we have done, I can't tell you how many tiny homes I've designed, cabins, cottages, tiny homes and accessory dwelling units. In other words, small residences is what we really focus on. And a big part of the expertise that I started to build over time was with tiny houses on wheels, as they were in that emergent sort of space. This being, I think, Robin, we met about 8 years ago. My wife and I came down and shot some video at a festival that the NOAA founders and were at, and so that's how we first met. Was we came down shooting for Living Tiny Legally's first video, and that was the same time we got involved in tiny homes. So as a practice, what we've done is build out designs. We've also worked with housing authorities, with different types of veterans groups and others, some disaster relief interests as well. But our big forte is on trying to help people understand what they want in a house, how that house can meet the needs that they have, and do so in a smaller footprint.
Let me ask you a question there, Tom. What is the process when someone says, I want to go tiny, I want to go smaller? What is the process that you go through to determine what this person would be best suited for that person, but also what would be best suited for, saving the planet, so to speak?
Yeah, I think the best question to answer first would be what do people need to do? And that would be, I highly recommend self-assessment. What is it that people want? If you can downsize within your own home, start to downsize in your own home as close to the bathroom and kitchen as possible. We moved into the office we had, which was a guest bedroom, and moved our bedroom into that bedroom. Then instead of just having a couch in there and a love seat, so we turned our office into our bedroom as well, and that was attached to a bathroom and around the corner from the kitchen. But what it did is it forced us to start looking at everything else in the house and what we didn't necessarily need, and those things that we did need, we started to really kind of divvy through, a life of raising children, getting them to college, doing everything that we needed to. Our part of it was to then take that step ourselves. So I would definitely
So basically
say
what you did was you had a bigger house. Let me clarify. You had a bigger house, but you started eliminating rooms and just trying to downsize in a big house.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what we essentially, as the kids moved out, we became empty nesters. And then the matter of the house being a big volume to heat and cool, and lots of windows to have to worry about, plumbing to have to worry about, it really started to become much more house than we needed. And we had already started to look at the next chapter of our lives. Had children when we were younger, got married at 23. So we're, as Gen Xers at now 55, we've been in the tiny house movement for about 8 years or more. And in that time, we said, what could we do? We don't need a big house. What could we move into? And the other challenge we faced, and I think this is an important one for a lot of people, is in the last few years, we've seen a lot more focus on accessory dwelling units. At the time we had our larger home, I wanted to take the garage and turn it into our studio and basically live out of that, or maybe carve out a piece of the house that kept that master bedroom and put downstairs in the garage space. We had 10-foot ceilings down there and a 2-car garage. It was plenty of space. Could we move in there? And the local building officials said no. And I said, well, why? And they said, because now you're taking single family, turning it into multifamily. And I got it, but I thought maybe there ought to be a path. And when we started getting into tiny houses on wheels, and it was like, well, that's actually a trailer and you can't live in something that mobile. And again, I felt like there might be a path in there. And so that's what led into all of the code compliance efforts and other things, certification bodies that we would work with, and trying to really kind of divine that path between what was best practice and what needed to become something that might be a regulatory standard.
And so that's how you kind of got moving in the direction of designing smaller spaces. And you talked about, cabins and things like that. So it's not just tiny houses on wheels that you've designed. Right. You've also designed some other types of smaller spaces.
Right, which would be a perfect way to tee up your second question, which was kind of what might people be able to do? I think that's what you were kind of leaning toward, is what decisions might they have to make? So beyond a self-assessment, I think, is also a matter of what do people want to have in their next home? And big questions around that, especially where tiny houses on wheels are concerned, is we often say, solve your parking first, solve your placement first, whatever that may be. And so if you really want to move into we've had a lot of, especially it seems a lot of women at the time, about 8 years ago or so, that were baby boomers and single. And, I will quote one of my past customers. She said, "I want to live near my kids and grandkids, but I don't want to be stinky grandma in the house." That's a direct quote. And I said, I get it. I get it. So what we ended up finding out was, as much as people may have wanted to have a tiny house on wheels parked in the driveway, what we also saw, and we have seen in the past number of years, is a lot of backlash. Once building officials started to see the popularity of this grow and expand, the other thing that started to happen is it was easier to recognize where something was really more of a DIY RV, which is what many tiny houses might be described as by a building official. And that presents a challenge. It's not, we don't allow that. Zoning doesn't allow that. You can't live in a vehicle. And, my way of looking at it is kind of like, I get it, but I don't know that that's right. I get it, but I don't know that that helps us solve the future challenges that I think we have in a world that is becoming increasingly populated, in a world that is facing climate change, which is likely to create climate migrants within the boundaries of our own countries, especially as I think it's, I forget the percentage, it seems like 68% or so of all the United States, if not the world, live near the coasts. And that means if we do see the types of sea level rise that we may see, then we're going to have a lot of people that need to move. We have a lot of folks that may want to live a more mobile sort of lifestyle. We have housing that's become so costly, almost $400,000 for the median home, first-time home buyers. People like our daughter cannot afford to buy a house. They don't have
Amen to
jobs
that.
that are necessarily secure. So the movable house makes a whole lot of sense. And our part of it has been like, what can we do to make it livable for people? If you have the decision to make of, I'm going to live in something like an RV, these are kind of the pathways. I don't mind living in it like an RV. Be prepared to driveway surf, or more likely be prepared to live in an RV park. I need a house. Well, then you need a house. The council allows for an accessory dwelling unit. That's great. Is this your home you're going to subdivide, or is this another home you're going to buy? And some questions like that. So a big part of what we try to look at is what's the viability of where people want to live, and what is it that they're, is allowed for them, and or their comfort of risk if they choose to live in something like an RV. I think there's more tendency of people to be comfortable living in RV parks, like we have quite frequently lived RV parks, or we lived in a marina when we had a sailboat, could go down to the sailboat. We've lived a lot of places like that. So I think the tendency that was there in the early days to think of RV parks as if they're mobile home parks, and think that that's not something that's going to be either safe or comfortable or somebody right next door. I think people are more used to that as being potentially one of the paths, which continues to keep the door open for the types of tiny houses on wheels that you guys look at and review, and people like iDesign and friends of ours build.
Yeah, and now you have that, and that's the reason for being on wheels. In other words, if you're in a situation where you have to move, it's not a real big hassle, a real big problem. In fact, I believe they have to, in order to be considered quote unquote an RV, you have to be able to move it within one day. I think there's a certain number of hours or something like that
Right.
you have to be able to move it. Now, where do you live now, and where have you lived? And are the same jurisdictions the same thing wherever you go, or does it matter in the U.S. where we place our tiny house, where we hail from?
Yeah, great question. So we started our journey, you did mention the ambulance. We started our journey in an RV, using that as in a big 34-foot fifth wheel. We had a big truck that we hauled it with. We downsized into a smaller RV and yet another smaller RV. And at that time, we were able to buy from a company that we used to work with, Housing Authority. We had built a shell that we took to a lot of the shows and showed people what we could do in the Workforce Development Center we were trying to establish. And at the end of that, opportunity, the life cycle of that wasn't viable for them. Well, they had the tiny house that we used to take to shows. So we bought the tiny house and had lived in the ambulance for about 8 months as we started to make it livable. We currently live in Floyd, Virginia, which is where we were about 3 years ago. So we live about 100 yards off of the Blue Ridge Parkway. I'm in the local library because we don't have good cell signal up there. But we moved into the tiny house just as it started, like right now, to get cold. So I mean, we were true DIYers at the point that we started finishing off the shell. So let me get it far enough along where we're not inhaling, any drywall dust or sawdust or something else like that. And because ambulance had no insulation beneath the floor, and come daybreak, it was an ice box. I don't care how much heat we try to throw at it. So now is it the same everywhere else have we lived? We lived in Florida for a while when we first NOAA was being founded, and we were coming to some of y'all's meetings. So we lived in Florida. We've lived in Alabama with Workforce Development Center. Our children were raised, and that's where we've lived mostly, is in the Richmond, Virginia area. So we've lived in that area. We most recently moved up to my mother-in-law's place for about a month with a tiny house in New Jersey, as she's 92 and needing to start to have, some family support. So at this point, I'm done owning a diesel. I would encourage anybody who thinks they need to have a truck and wants to call that as a part of their budget, I would say, please take a look at that budget for that diesel and maybe think about putting it in your house. Because to be quite honest, the best way for us to move our house is to rent a U-Haul, and $500 later for a, halfway across the state sort of move, I'm done. I don't have any repair fees. I'm throwing money at gas, sure, 10 miles a gallon, but it's better than owning something that only gets 10 miles to the gallon and trying to treat that as your daily driver.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, what he just said. And in other words, if you're going, and Tom moves a little bit more than a lot of people do. A lot of times they build a tiny house on wheels and move once or twice. And the point of going out and buying a big old truck to move that thing is probably not your best way to go. Even getting a U-Haul, that's one way to go. But there's also the possibility of just hiring a mover, somebody with a CDL license and a truck and the insurance, and let them do it too.
That's probably that's how most of the builders we work with, and even some of the tiny home customers that we have, a lot of times it is a delivery. And in many cases, the houses, I hear from so many customers, I hope I don't have to move it more than once. In other words, they want to keep that door open for the chance to move it. It may not work out where they want to be, but they really are setting their sights on trying to find that first and ideal piece of property or that ideal living situation, but they want the backup plan. And in those cases, not only would I say, please don't put the money into a truck if you don't want to have to own a truck. We see where, fuel costs are today. And the other thing to think about is if you're not going to move it that often, and especially if you're going to hire a pro to do it, I highly recommend looking at going 10 wide on your house. The permit that they need to pull is probably already in their back pocket. And then having something that's 10 foot wide, an extra inch or two in width of the house makes a big difference. Imagine having an extra 2 feet. So if you're designing your own home and you don't think you need to pull it yourself, then I would highly recommend looking at doing something maybe 10 foot wide.
And 10 feet is a good number, guys, only because with the 10 foot wide, you only need a wide load and a CDL license. If you go wider than that, go to 12 feet, now you're going to have an escort along with it, and that's a little more expensive. And there's one website out there that I know of. It's called UShip, the letter U, ship.com. And what they do is they utilize, truckers utilize this website. So if they go to a certain place, they don't want to have to deadhead all the way back. And you sometimes get your house moved for just whatever the gas cost is for him to bring your unit back to wherever you want it to go. So it's called uship.com. Make sure he's got good insurance and all for whatever he's towing. But I've had some real good estimates on moves from that company.
Okay. And there's people who've shown up to tiny house shows who also do move tiny houses. So the difference between almost, we can pull anything. The folks that pull those cars on car haulers with regular trucks are called hot shots. It's just the nickname for their type of towing. Moving a tiny house is not different than moving an RV, and yet it's just different enough, especially where if it's pouring down rain, you'd like to know that person pulls over because it's not made to necessarily shed water that blasts up under the eaves and has a way to worm its way into the house. So I think going with a company that's experienced moving tiny houses and understands that they're take just a little bit more of take a little more attention to love what's behind you as opposed to not really giving a crap about it. Whenever we pull our house, and she's 8 by 12 foot long. So, we live in an extremely small tiny house and designed it to pull the shows. So it's highly aerodynamic. I don't mind pulling the tiny house, but if I had something larger, and I've pulled some bigger tiny houses too, the chance of risk is high enough pulling it yourself that's another it's another point of liability you face. And so hiring a professional with insurance, with the credibility that's there, I think there's a lot of good pros, more pros to that than cons.
Yeah. Did somebody have a question? Ron, can you mute your, hello, Ron, can you mute your, or Jordan, can you mute Ron's, please? Hello, hello.
Someone's in the
Jordan,
bathroom or next to the train track somewhere.
Sounded like a jet landing. Yeah, I
Or
just had a
maybe-
quick question.
He had
I
his
have,
window down, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. I have people ask me periodically about, is there a particular builder I can recommend that specializes in green builds? Would you be open to me sending referrals your way?
I'd be happy to. I'm on the. I think it would help if you all can on the admin side can figure out whose mic is open and close that. That would. Be
Yeah, I
helpful,
think
'cause
we're
it's-
working on that right now.
That's all good.
Jordan,
to answer the
are you
question,
there?
no, I'm not a builder, so from the building standpoint, and green building wise, we do work with structural insulated panels, and we do focus on the design side toward design efficiencies, air quality, and other things. That's what we tend to do on design. As a builder, though, we work with other builders, and I would say finding that right builder for you is a matter of referral. There may be some we can refer you to. And that's something you could talk to me about offline, because we try not to be too open about, there may be a much better builder out there than somebody we know, and I wouldn't want to just give somebody a good plug because I know they're a good friend and they're a good builder, while there may be somebody out there who if I knew them, I would maybe give them some priority. So you can reach out to me on that as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, and guys, if you want to have a question, feel free. There is, I'm going to try mine here down at the bottom where it says reactions. You can click on that and then click your raise hand. See how my hand got raised? That moves you right up to the front. And so we can see you. And then you just remember to lower your hand after you've been recognized. So anyway, where were we, Tom? Talking about moving.
Yeah, and then green building as well.
Yeah. Now, here's a real tough question, and I don't know the answer to it, so I'm going to ask you. You may not be able to answer this one either, but when you're talking about green building, obviously it costs a little bit more to go green. You know, the products are more expensive, and it's kind of like buying organic at the grocery store. They're a little bit more expensive for the same squash or cucumbers or things like that. Where do you draw the line where you say, okay, I have done, because it's a small house, you know, it's 200 square feet. Where do you draw the line to say, okay, I'm saving money, but I don't want to go crazy with my expenses on going crazy with the green build. And I know we've had one LEED certified tiny house out of Jacksonville that was done. So where do you draw the line when you're talking green building and energy, and then factor that into the truth of the matter is it's a very, very small house also.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing we like to say is you can finally afford to go green. And the reason is because what you're looking at whenever we talk about building materials or somebody's putting together an estimate, you're typically looking at either the cost per square foot of a wall system, a roof system, flooring, or other thing, or you're looking at the linear footage that you're paying for. So my point in this is you have a tiny house that's maybe, let's say 100 foot of wall. 100 foot of wall would only be a portion of a wall on a house or on a larger house. You know, 100 foot would be a very large tiny house. But the point is, I think that you've got a point to be able to draw the line with that fast, because the overall volume of your house is smaller. The amount of material that you have to use is smaller. And the other thing that you can look at is that in case of, like, I'm experienced with SIPs. I like structural insulated panels. I like them a lot. They are more expensive, but there's a lot of advantages with them, including the fact that you won't spend as much time building your house. But the big thing is with tiny houses is that while the local building code may require at least something like a 2x6 in the wall, because you're trying to get to something that the code officials look at as the compliant for the R value of insulation in the wall. With the 2x4 based house like we have, our walls are 2x4s, our roof are 2x4s. We didn't build it with SIPs. And we still heat the entire house with 400-watt space heater. We have a nice little fireplace that has a thermostat on it, but the 400-watt space heater just stays on and keeps the house, we call it the bubble, as cold as it was up here in the mountains with the wind blowing 60 miles an hour. And I mean, it was below zero in terms of stepping outside, and our house was comfortable. So I think the draw the line is you can scale back on the thickness of the walls. That's going to save you money and material costs, regardless of whether you're stick, steel, or structural insulated panel. And the same goes for the roof, and the same goes with other stuff. I think a lot of people get really kind of bent around the axle between rock wool, fiberglass, maybe, some other spray foam insulation. I think depending on people's need for certain types of air quality, there's good reasons to look at different insulation. But I think most people, a lot of builders have found that one of the best, most efficient ways to build is with spray foam insulation. And unless you have some inherent issue with spray foam insulation, you'll find the cost, the ease of that installation to be done by a professional if you're building with a professional. If you want to try to buy a box of it and do it yourself, which is another way, is to buy the kit and do it yourself. The insulation there is really a matter of if you want more R value. The only cautionary tale I would give, and this is from hearing horror stories, is just don't let the spray foam exceed the inside of your wall. Build your walls, put up your exterior sheathing, and then use the spray foam. But again, you don't want to have to break out a saw, a knife, a chisel, and try to scrape away at solid foam insulation. Spray foam is incredibly good and durable, and you really do want that skin of it that coats itself. So it's just one of the ways a lot of people go, but spray foam for an entire house would be expensive. We chose to go with fiberglass because it was easier and faster, and it was getting cold up here in the mountains, and I knew I could do it myself. Had I built my own house and didn't start with the shell we had been taking to shows, I would probably move towards structural insulated panels, because unbroken thermal barrier, OSB on both sides of it, gives you a good nail base for exterior cladding, interior wallboard. It's incredibly structurally sound. I'm not trying to pitch it as if everybody has to buy this, but there's a lot of pros to it. And the assembly is hours versus days. And so I think that's a place where the budget would be higher, but the cost savings in terms of life dollars, the time I put the bunny ears in the air, there they go again. The life dollars that it takes, of your time to put in something else, to do something else is a good point to weigh. But I think putting this time and effort and money into it up front will yield benefits for decades down the road. And that's I think that's highly valuable.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. And also, with our tiny house, we were spending $25 a month in an electric bill, and it's it's not that much money for the power. So we were looking at, okay, and we only had spray foam in the ceiling. We did do closed cell spray foam in the ceiling to get a higher R value, and then we put fiberglass in the walls and the floors. But the spray foam guy wanted a minimum for to come out, and so we did 2 ceilings, and we met his minimum. We went over his minimum a little bit. So if you're builders and you're thinking those, closed cell spray foam is about an R7 per inch, and so if you're trying to get an R21, 3 inches would be sufficient. If you're going R28, obviously 4 inches would have to be that. And there's one place in Blaine County, Idaho, that is requiring R28 in the ceilings. So if you use 2x6, you shouldn't have any problem. 2x6 rafters, which most people do now. You shouldn't have any problem putting in 4 inches of closed cell spray foam in there. And then, you were talking about 2x4 rafters. We only use 2x4 rafters when there's a gable roof. If it's a shed roof, the span has to be a 2x6 rafter, 16 inches on center. So I just wanted to throw that out there to everybody.
Yeah. If you do the single slope, you have one long piece of lumber that's having to span from side to side. And while it's probably less a matter of concern about it caving in unless you have incredible snow loads than it is a matter of the deflection that occurs. And that's just the shape of that board is going to over time sag on its own. And we have places like the loft is somewhere that I know a lot of people build 2x4 base lofts, and a lot of what I design are 2x6, and it's from personal experience. Yeah, I lose a couple of inches up in the loft. We don't sit in bed. We don't watch TV in bed. I never take a laptop up to our loft. So for me, the bed is really just to climb in there, go to sleep. And the reason I mention this is because the only place I've seen any deflection from us with an 8-foot span across there is with the loft. And because I did some box beams, so I put some trim work around it. And I know that there's deflection because the little bit of a reveal that I left, it's about a 1/16 of an inch or so, is gone right in the middle while it's still out on both sides. So I know that's the evidence that the 2x4s underneath have sagged just a little bit over time and from the weight. The house is going to do that kind of stuff, but I think that's something to consider, either doubling up on 2x4s, or there's other ways to span across there while retaining a little bit of the headroom height. But just be cautious about that.
What we've seen on that, Tom, was double 2x4s with 1/2-inch plywood in the middle, like a header, like a,
Do it like a header,
when you
yeah.
build a header. And that extra bit of plywood really makes a huge difference. So if you do double 2x4s with 1/2-inch plywood in the middle, and you put those 16 inches on center, you should be pretty good, pretty strong, because a loft isn't going to be, I mean, what is it, 30 pounds per square foot or less, maybe, in a loft. So,
And I'll add to that and say a lot of lofts that we see today will either have a stairway beside them, and our loft is not. We have a ladder. I mean, our house is 12 foot long on the floor, so I mean, it's very small. And so we have a ladder that goes up to it. With most tiny houses I design, there is a stair system that goes up to it. We oftentimes have a landing so somebody can stand at the top or sit down and put on their pants and things. And the reason that's important is because now we're breaking that full width span into something that's bearing down onto a bathroom wall as an interior wall, or onto something that's going to be part of the cabinet system around a refrigerator, which is typical to do when you're taking a loft, stairway up to the loft, is to put the refrigerator or some other thing down there. So the point is you're actually breaking the 8-foot span into something more like a 6-foot span with most tiny houses. And over the bathroom, depending on how you want to run it, a lot of times we can actually take those rafters and floor joists and turn them so that they actually go from the bathroom wall back, which has a benefit of making that a shorter run, typically about 40, 42 inches. And it also means that you're going to have your venting go out the back of the house as opposed to trying to worm its way through the sidewall. I just hate to have the show face of the house. I put the bunny ears in the air again, to put the show face, to put something like a vent on the outside of the house if we can help it. The tongue isn't a pretty end of the house. The tail is kind of it's another place to have lights and other stuff that feels real trailery. So where possible, I like to have that kind of infrastructure exit the house where it's already not pretty, as opposed to on the face of the house where you're going to come and see it most often. So.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. What would you say, define the term net zero? Can you kind of give us when we're building a house to net zero, do you know what we're talking about when we're trying to do that?
Explain it for me. I have a sense of it, but I mean, if you've got a definition, that'll help.
Well, I don't know 100%, but basically net zero to me anyway, is at the end of the day, your utility bills are zero. You have enough, composting toilets, solar, et cetera, so that your utility bills end up, or at least with the electric company, it ends up zero. You're either buying electricity. If you use the grid for storage, you're buying electricity at some point, but then you're selling electricity back to them at some point. And at the end of the day, at the end of the year, whatever that is, you net zero cost. Either you don't get any money back from the power company, but you don't have to pay any out to the power company. But then,
Right.
then when we're talking about that's just electricity and power, and because if we're doing an off-grid, what are some tips for people who want to go off-grid, some things that they can do to cut down on their electric bill if they want to go off-grid?
Well, let's take the, I guess I would say you said off-grid. So let's go ahead and look at this in kind of and I'll throw an RV term into it. It's called boondocking. Whenever you effectively have, no service, you're out there in the wilds of the woods. And a lot of people who want to set up a tiny house on a homestead or maybe have it on a piece of recreational property may not have power run out to the property. They're more than likely, especially people like us who would buy a piece of property as raw land, we're likely not yet to have a well, and we wouldn't necessarily have a septic system that we're ready to afford to put into it. That's part of the cost going into it. So the more, like you were suggesting, net zero is from my understanding, more often on the side of it where you're having some form of power generation, which on a tiny house can come from solar on the roof. And if you're doing that, and then you're also grid tied, I would say net zero has a better chance of being something you can truly calculate if you're tied to the grid 24/7 for an entire calendar year. If the goal is to make it as earth friendly as possible, which is a nice way to say keep the costs down, the better the thermal insulation in the house, the better you are at being able to make sure that you have good quality air in there, but you're not building up moisture value inside the house because of excess breathing or using propane stoves and other things. The better you are at being able to generate that power then offsets what you need as a load that has to be transferred to your solar system. And why does that matter? Well, those are the days when it's overcast, there may be snow on your panels, the hurricane came through and your battery is discharged in the course of the day. So I think A big thing I would look at is probably with the tiny houses, less of a net zero approach that makes more sense to me, at least in a home on a piece of property, fixed to the property as a permanent house. But there's definitely advantages to look at for solar use. When it comes to solar, anything you can take out, and you want to build a budget for your solar right off the bat. And anything that makes heat is drawing amperage. And if it's drawing amperage, it's just going to start sucking power. So the better things to start to look at are how can you reduce your power? LED lights help with that. Good insulation and good air sealing helps with that. There's a lot of things that can help with that. So you lean on your power utility as little as possible, or in the case of a true off-grid scenario, like we've had when the snow's knocked the power lines down, break out our little Honda, generator and crank it up, and know that you have such limited power use that you're able to run off of a small generator. Or if you needed to bring something like a buddy stove in, which we've got one of those as a backup. We've lived enough in RVs to feel like, and campground power can be kind of, spotty sometimes, or up in the mountains for sure. So I think we definitely kind of look at the things that we have as backups for power. When the power goes out, I've got a generator. If the generator runs out of gas or whatever happens with the generator, ran it for 3 days and it started running a little spotty. We needed to run some seafoam through it. It would be nice to have, and we have it, a little LP gas, a little buddy heater that would just smoke us out of the house. So I would say be prepared to live off the grid. And with water right now in our house, because it started as a demo unit, we truly, our tiny house is probably not our forever home. We have to bring our water in manually. So we go to our spigot that's right there at the RV site, fill up water and take it into the house. And we use a camp toilet because we have a septic system right there. If we lived on our own property, we would probably truck water in from somewhere else, 7 gallons or so at a time. And as far as the waste water goes, gray water use is very minimal and probably low impact. Not necessarily legal to throw gray water on the ground, probably not from a health official standpoint, but composting toilets make a good point there, because we flush so much fresh water down the toilet just to get rid of our waste. A composting toilet, on the other hand, people think it composted and just kind of magically goes away. You're just starting the drying process within the house, and then the composting happens over about a year or two outside. So composting toilets would be a good way to handle that.
And what I've heard from the composting people, because composting separates the liquid from the solids, that if you mix the liquid half and half with water, that you can legally, use it to put around your trees and that kind of thing. And there is a gray water filter system that you can utilize if there's one that's basically made up of a bunch of filters, and then there's another way to do it where your gray water flows across some rocks and eventually dissipates, and that kind of a thing. So there are some gray water filtering systems that the health department does recognize as being legal, and all of that. And then there's the your power can be lessened. If we get back to the solar, when you say anything that puts off heat is going to be drawing power, those inverters that change the solar amperage to 120 volts, the solar volts to 120 volts, I think they come out either 12 or 24 volts normally off of a solar panel. Well, they have what's called a charge controller that controls the charge going into the batteries, but then they have an inverter that inverts into 120 volts. So if you are going to just go totally off grid, I would recommend, instead of having an inverter, just use 24 volt lights. You can buy those 12 volts and 24 volt lights, and that way you don't have to have an inverter. You lose about 10% of your heat, of your electricity, by having to have that inverter to turn it into 120 volts. And then obviously we haven't talked about propane, and we haven't talked about wood, wood stoves in cold climates. Those would be other than, electric, using electric. There are certain things that you do need electric for the most part, which is lighting. Other than that, even water, I think hot water, you can even do that with propane. So there wouldn't be much need for a big solar system if you worked it right, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I would personally say, as someone who's, designed homes and have heard from people, those who want to be off grid, I think the more you start to look at what it costs to actually to produce the type of system for what people want to do. You get to that, you were asking about at what point. The point that I've often found is where people get to that place is that I can't get rid of. And then you get to the baseline of my refrigerator is going to draw this much. My hot water heater is going to still draw a little bit for the fan in my heating system. You know, you get to a certain point where you're going to have to, unless you go fully off grid. And wood stoves and tiny houses. I mean, remember, these things eat air. They not only eat the fuel you put into it, they suck air out of the house. So the wood stoves and RVs are you know, no can do from an RV standpoint. And for a tiny house, I've seen so many people want to put one in their tiny house. I think they're lovely, but to be honest with you, they're so small and they're so hungry that you're cutting branches, you're cutting sticks with a Sawzall to make 6-inch long logs that you're throwing in. I mean, you're going to constantly have to feed that thing. So I think the point of pressure of how real is it to live in something that's that far off grid is certainly good if you've got a cabin scenario, more so than something like a tiny house on wheels, because you're likely to have a larger space or you're likely to have something that's not as well insulated. But if you focus on the insulation and air sealing being a part of that, then what you start to combat is loss of air and buildup of humidity that can create black mold and other air quality issues. So the balance in there starts to become this: how much is it costing for solar for me to have a hot water heater and have a dishwasher and have, you know, if you can bring those things down, that's great. The wiring, what we chose to do, because I did look at doing solar on our house, it's so small, why not just look at it? What I chose to do was not to, because I figured 10% loss of power in the inversion, and it's something to think about. Yes, you'll have that, but what we chose to do was wire the house conventionally, and then what we have on the front of the house is a switch that would allow us to switch between, either get it from our plug-in right there at the pylon on the campsite, or a generator, or anything that hooks to power, or flip the switch the other way when we do get solar. So I'm okay down the road, save myself money today and for 5-6 years until I get a solar system. Let the technology keep on building to the point where the batteries hold more power, where the solar panels collect more power going into it, and then the loss of the 10% or so on the inversion side is likely a better balance for us, because we've already lived, you know, learned to live with less power, learned to live with things that suck less amperage. And living that simply, I think you've already kind of trained yourself to live in an environment where the solar doesn't have to be quite so intensive. And so we chose to go with standard wiring in our home, because I felt like then I'm not in, and my goodness, finding somebody to install solar and all of the control mechanisms that might go into it if you want smart house, it becomes so complex so fast that, especially if you're trying to contract it out, you'll probably make more phone calls that end up at a dead end than you are going to be able to have somebody who can even make time to come out and see your tiny house, let alone even want to work on a tiny house because they've never done one before. And that's a real point to consider with any tiny house.
And if you look at it from, you know, maybe someday, and you set up the you know, the electric panel and the box and things like that, access to it, where you could from at a later date do that, then yeah, that's certainly smart. Well, we're kind of running out of time here. Is there anybody out there that's got any burning questions that they would like to ask Tom before he scoots on? If so, please put it in the chat or raise your hand. It's certainly been eye-opening for me to see. I didn't know you were out down to a, what'd you say, how big is yours? 14?
We have less than 100 square foot on the floor, and it's 8 foot wide by, it was a 12-foot trailer, but we put a bay window on it. So we extended the front of it by 2 feet. So it's truly 14 foot long on the floor. And we also extended a cantilevered portion for the bed, so we'd have more vaulted living space. So we've kicked the back of the house back by 2 feet. We've got an overhang over our door in the front of it. So it's 100 square foot. It's actually about 98 of actual floor area. You know, and I'm not counting where we have the cabinetry around the wheel wells so that I can keep it below 100 foot. But if I were to count that area as usable, which is really not on the floor, it would be about 110 square foot.
Wow. Well, that is small. And you know, we're currently working on a 14-foot tiny house, which is 8 by 14. It's small for tiny houses, but this one looks like it's going to have a loft. And we've done it actually. We have one, believe it or not, that is 50 square feet. And then, you know, we used it in a show. It was just a show piece. And then we said, well, let's put it on a trailer. So we put it on a trailer. We used it for a Christmas parade. And then after that, we said, okay, well, let's put a toilet and a shower in it. So the only place to put it would be on the tongue. So we put the toilet and the shower on the tongue, but the main area is 5 by 10. And it's got a little kitchenette in it, a little air conditioning. And then the guy that was renting it out has been living in it for a couple of years and just loving it. So it's a little smaller than I would want, but certainly when you're talking about something that, it's mine, then I think, he has that pride of, this is mine. He doesn't pay much rent, but it's his.
Yeah.
Leanne.
Yes, I remember that tiny house. You won the Christmas parade in a Popka.
Yeah, we did. We want to
trophy.
best in show.
Right.
Nancy has a question for Tom. Have you
Yes.
written a book yet?
I have thought to, we've put together enough of the workshops that we've run in the past and different things. I do have the thoughts for the book and what I would put together as a book. So I've got an outline for it. With COVID, we basically pushed a few things back, and among those is to come out with a line of homes that we would have that people could put together from panel packs and others. And so that's what we're moving toward right now. I would probably do a book at some point, but not at this point.
Awesome. Well, Nancy says she's looking forward to reading it eventually.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I watched your video. I liked how you and your wife just little by little got your house done. I don't think I got to the end of it, but
I can't call it done yet. I have cabinet doors to build, and because it's coastal design, I decided it would be faced with cabinet doors that look like we reclaimed those the sticks that they used to build dunes. And so I've got another set I've got those now ripped down, but with all of our moving and the way that our life has gone, we've moved so frequently that we've not been able to catch up on everything. And it's extremely trimmed out inside. I would not, somebody's like, what would it cost to do this on a larger house? I'm like, I wouldn't do it on a larger house. We push it. It's cool because we've got bits and pieces of wood we've pushed through the saw to make our own trim work that have come from different places, including a cabin on my wife's mother's property. So there's a lot of bits and pieces of wood that we know we can say, well, this came from here and this came from there. So it's been neat to build it ourselves. But truly, if you don't want to live in a job site, I would say, find the money to hire somebody to take it as far as possible so that what you're left with is maybe painting and minimizing trim and building up over time the extra accoutrements you add to it.
Right,
All
great.
right. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. Guys, if you thought this was valuable, please put in the chat thanking him. I'm sure he would appreciate that. If you have any suggestions on how we can improve our Tuesdays, feel free to contact Leanne or put something in the chat there. But I'm going to turn it back over to you, Leanne, and let you kind of wrap it up.
All right, wrap it up. Well, Tom, thank you so very much. You just offered a lot of great information, very informative. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to help us out with our tiny talk tonight. I'm seeing lots of comments. That was awesome. Loved hearing about solar. Thank you, Tom.
Oh, sure.
Great seeing you again.
Thank you all. I do appreciate it. Here, we'll do the old school goodbye on you.
Yeah, right. Well,
Thank you all for
everyone,
coming out.
like Robin mentioned earlier, we won't have a workshop tomorrow night or Thursday night, so we can enjoy the holiday with our families. Noah's offices are closed and our inspectors get some time off too to enjoy some turkey or whatever they want to eat. So we'll see you guys Monday. We'll have another builder night. We'll have Andy with Firefly Tiny Homes, and that'll be really interesting. He's a great builder, and so I'm looking forward to that. So with that, if you guys don't have any other questions, we will see you Monday. Hope you're doing well. Have a great rest of the week, and by all means, enjoy your Thanksgiving, and just want to say we are grateful and thankful to all of you. Have a great night.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Bye.
Good night.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye.
Y'all take care.